You're sitting on the exam table. You can hear that crinkly paper shifting right under you.
Yeah, the absolute worst sound.
Right. And you're holding a printout of your lab results. Or, maybe you're reading a discharge summary on your phone.
And your eyes are just scanning past all those numbers looking for the actual words.
Exactly. And suddenly you see it. A term ending in osis, cirrhosis, necrosis, thrombosis, and automatically your heart rate just spikes.
Oh, for sure. It sounds so definitive. It sounds like bad news.
It carries this immense psychological weight. We're conditioned to fear the terminology of medicine, like almost as much as the symptoms themselves.
Yeah, when a doctor drops an osis on you, it feels like a gavel coming down.
Well, we are doing a deep dive into a stack of medical history, etymology, and public health sources today to take that exact moment of panic and, just totally dismantle it.
We really want to demystify this one tiny but incredibly powerful piece of medical jargon.
The mission here is to give you a shortcut to health literacy, so that the next time you look at a medical chart, you aren't completely overwhelmed by the ancient Greek.
Right. You'll actually understand the hidden history and the real-world stakes behind the words that doctors use every day.
Because when you peel back the layers on that specific suffix, you uncover some really fierce medical rivalries, massive laboratory blunders, and a fundamental shift in how human beings understand illness.
It is wild. You really get to see how a simple grammar rule ended up shaping the entire landscape of modern pathology.
So let's start with the baseline, right? What they teach you in a standard medical vocabulary class. The textbook shorthand for osis is that it means condition of, process, or state of.
Yeah, that's the literal translation.
But in practice, the sources show it is almost always taught as signaling an abnormal condition, usually something chronic, degenerative, or proliferative.
Right, and medical students are basically taught to memorize that definition by contrasting it against another very famous suffix, which is itis.
Okay, so here is how I've always categorized that contrast in my head. Tell me if this holds up.
Go for it.
If it cosis, like, appendicitis or dermatitis, is a sudden fire in the body.
Like redness, heat, swelling.
Yeah, an acute crisis. Then osis is the slow, silent rust. It's a structural breakdown over time.
The fire versus rust framework is incredibly useful for navigating modern diagnostics. It really captures how contemporary medicine categorizes these processes.
But I'm guessing there's a catch.
A huge catch. The historical reality completely flips the script. That rust concept is a totally modern invention.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The suffix osis was never originally meant to be a disease word at all.
So it didn't imply sickness, like ever?
Not even slightly. If you look at the ancient Greek, the suffix was a completely neutral grammatical tool.
Okay, so what did it actually do?
Greek speakers used it simply to turn a verb into an abstract noun. It just described a resulting state or a process taking place. It carried zero pathological baggage.
So it was basically the ancient Greek equivalent of adding ing or ness to the end of an English word.
That is the perfect way to look at it, honestly. And this absolute neutrality actually survives in our everyday language today, completely divorced from the scary medical context.
Oh, like the word osmosis.
Exactly. Or metamorphosis, which just means a shaping across.
Or even diagnosis itself, right?
Right.
Which literally translates to knowing apart.
Right. These are perfectly normal, often highly desirable biological or cognitive processes.
Even mitosis, like cellular division. Without mitosis, human life doesn't even exist.
Right. Nobody looks through a microscope, sees a cell dividing, and diagnoses the petri dish with a disease.
Which brings us to the pivotal historical question of this deep dive. If osis started as a harmless grammatical tool to describe a process, how did it transform into a label that literally terrifies patients in clinical settings today?
Well, the sources point directly to the 19th century, specifically the massive explosion of scientific medicine in Paris and Vienna during the 1800s.
So what was going on there?
You have to picture the medical landscape of the time. For centuries, medicine was largely based on humoral theory.
The idea that you were sick because your bodily fluids were out of balance.
Exactly. But in the early 1800s, there was a huge revolution. Doctors started performing systematic autopsies.
Okay, so they were actually opening up bodies and looking closely at organs in ways they never really had before.
Right. They were shifting from philosophical medicine to structural medicine. And because they were suddenly seeing all these physical, structural changes in the organs, they needed a systematic way to describe them.
The existing vocabulary just wasn't enough anymore.
No, it wasn't. So The pathologists in Paris and Vienna essentially hijacked osis.
They hijacked it.
Yeah, they recruited this totally neutral Greek suffix to label the strange new conditions they were discovering on the autopsy tables.
I mean, it makes sense. It was a purely practical move. They needed a naming convention, and this ancient grammatical tool was just sitting right there in the classical texts.
A classic example of this comes from René Laennec in 1819.
Oh, the French physician.
Right, he's most famous for inventing the stethoscope, but he's also credited with coining the term cirrhosis.
Okay, I want to pause on cirrhosis right here, because the etymology in the sources completely subverted my expectations.
It usually does.
When anyone hears the word cirrhosis, the immediate universal association is the liver. We just assume it's a highly technical Latin or Greek term for liver failure.
It is entirely associated with the liver today. But what did the sources reveal about the root word Laennec actually used?
There is literally no liver in the word at all.
None.
He built it from the Greek word kyros, which just means tawny or orange-yellow.
Yeah. He was performing an autopsy examining a severely diseased liver. The surface was hard, nodular, and had this very distinctive yellowish-orange tint.
So he just attached osis to the color.
Exactly. Cirrhosis literally just translates to the condition of being orange-yellow.
That feels almost alarmingly simplistic. You know, we treat it like this profound scientific diagnosis, but it's really just a 19th century doctor looking at an organ and saying, well, it's turned orange.
It is pretty funny when you think about it, but it reveals how much of our medical vocabulary was born out of raw, naked observation rather than, like, a deep molecular understanding of the disease.
And to explain why it looks orange, the sources noted that the liver is trying to repair itself from chronic damage.
Right, and in the process, it builds up excessive fibrous scar tissue.
And that scarring distorts the blood flow and changes the physical appearance of the organ.
Exactly. And since we are focusing on health literacy today, it is vital to point out a major misconception here.
Right. Cirrhosis is almost always stigmatized as a disease caused solely by alcohol abuse.
Yeah, but the condition is just the scarring process itself. It can be caused by viral hepatitis or, increasingly today, by non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
So the word itself just describes the physical state of the organ, not the behavior of the patient.
Exactly. Now, Laennec gave us a word based on a color, but a few years later, another pathologist demonstrated a completely different, much more precise approach to using the suffix.
You're talking about Jean Lobstein, the Alsatian pathologist who coined osteoporosis in 1833.
Yes. If cirrhosis is an etymological wildcard, osteoporosis is the textbook perfect application of the suffix. It follows the structural formula flawlessly.
Right, because osteo means bone, poros means pore or passage, and osis means condition of, so the condition of porous bone.
It is incredibly literal. Lobstein was basically observing bones that had lost their density and become honeycombed and brittle.
It's just a 19th century word-building exercise that now carries massive public health weight. I mean, the sources note that roughly half of all women and up to a quarter of men over the age of 50 will experience a bone fracture related to osteoporosis.
It's a massive issue. Tens of millions of people live with a diagnosis that was literally constructed piece by piece in 1833.
And by the 20th century, that specific Lobstein approach, building words like Lego bricks with roots and suffixes, was formalized into the curriculum for nursing and allied health students.
Which is exactly why osis feels like an unbreakable scientific law today, rather than the ad hoc experimental naming convention it actually started as.
Which honestly brings up a really unsettling question. 19th century doctors used osis to cement their physical observations into the medical dictionary.
Right.
But what happens when their physical observation is completely chemically wrong?
Oh, this is where the history of the suffix exposes a rather embarrassing reality about the medical establishment.
Yeah, we have to talk about Rudolf Virchow.
We do. Working in 1858, Virchow is universally recognized as the father of modern cellular pathology.
He was a huge deal.
Massive. He was the one who pushed the use of osis down to the microscopic level. He coined terms like thrombosis to describe cellular-level processes gone wrong.
But just a few years earlier, in 1854, he made one of the most famous naming errors in the history of science.
He really did. So set the scene for us. He's looking through a microscope at diseased tissue. What does he actually see?
Okay, so he found these strange, waxy deposits building up in the organs of his patients. And to figure out the chemical makeup of these deposits, he applied an iodine stain. In the 1850s, this was a standard laboratory test for carbohydrates.
Because if you pour iodine on a sample and it contains starch, the iodine molecules slip inside the coiled structure of the starch.
And the whole thing turns a deep blue or violet color.
Exactly. So Virchow applies the iodine to human tissue, and he gets that exact blue-violet color reaction.
Logically, he concludes he is looking at some kind of starch buildup.
Makes perfect sense at the time. So he names the substance amyloid, derived from the Latin amylum, meaning starch.
And he names the fatal disease caused by these deposits amyloidosis.
The condition of having starch deposits.
Except modern science knows exactly what those deposits are, and they have absolutely nothing to do with starch.
Nothing at all. They are misfolded proteins.
It was literally just a chemical coincidence.
A profound coincidence. The misfolded proteins happen to form these complex structures called beta-pleated sheets, and the physical shape of those protein sheets just happens to trap the iodine molecules in a way that creates a color reaction nearly identical to starch.
But wait. Once later, chemists and pathologists realized that amyloid was actually a protein. Why didn't they just rename the disease? I mean, science updates its terminology all the time.
Well, you run into the problem of path dependence and literature lock-in. By the time they realized the mistake, the term amyloidosis was already ubiquitous. It was in all the international medical journals, it was in the textbooks, it was on the patient charts.
So changing it would have caused massive confusion across the global medical community.
Exactly.
And one of the most serious systemic diseases in pathology is permanently named after a 19th century laboratory illusion. It's basically a fossilized mistake.
It proves how much absolute authority we surrender to Greek and Latin suffixes. Once you attach an osis to a word, it sounds so official and authoritative that it feels like, questioning gravity.
Seriously. And if the medical establishment can get logged into a chemical illusion simply because the word sounds official, it makes you wonder what else can be manufactured.
Oh, for sure.
The sources highlight something even more cynical than a lab error. Let's look at deliberate corporate manipulation.
Yes, the story of halitosis.
So the word comes from the Latin halitus, meaning breath. For the entire 19th century, it was an incredibly obscure, dusty term buried in a few medical journals.
Nobody used it in casual conversation.
Right, nobody. And then the 1920s hit, and the Listerine company decides they need a new angle to sell mouthwash.
The Listerine advertising campaign is an absolute masterclass in psychological manipulation.
It really is.
Before the 1920s, bad breath was certainly considered unpleasant, but it was just a social faux pas. It was like having messy hair.
But Listerine took that ordinary, socially awkward trait and framed it as a medical pathology.
They did. They ran ads showing these devastated young women who couldn't find a husband.
And the copy didn't say, your breath smells bad. It said, you might be suffering from halitosis.
Pay attention to the phonetics of the word there. The mere sound of that Greek suffix carries the weight of a clinical diagnosis.
It completely rewrites the psychology of the consumer.
It manufactures a sense of disease around an everyday embarrassment, creating this urgent need for the cure that Listerine just happened to sell.
It's incredibly manipulative. It demonstrates that the boundaries of what we consider a disease are a lot blurrier than we'd like to admit.
And those boundaries were actually the source of massive, bitter controversies during the 19th century, particularly when it came to drawing the line between our two rival suffixes.
The osis and the itis.
Yes.
The fire versus the rust.
Exactly. In the early 19th century, there was a prominent French physician named François Broussais, and he promoted a wildly popular theory that came to be known as Broussaiism.
It sounds like a political movement.
It practically operated like one. Broussais believed that all disease, every single ailment in the human body, originated from inflammation of the internal organs.
Primarily the gastrointestinal tract, right?
Yes. He called it physiological medicine, but it was essentially a dogma that all illness was an irritation, a fire.
So under his theory, every single medical diagnosis should end in itis. Gastritis, arthritis, bronchitis.
He diagnosed itis constantly, and his primary treatment was applying leeches to drain the inflammation.
Yikes.
Yeah. But as pathologists like Virchow developed better microscopes and looked closer at the cellular structure of organs, they realized Broussais was fundamentally wrong.
Because many chronic fatal diseases showed no signs of inflammation whatsoever.
Exactly. The organs weren't on fire, they were just slowly falling apart.
They were degenerating. They were losing their structural integrity over time.
And that is why the suffix osis became so critical to modern medicine. It finally gave doctors the necessary vocabulary to describe the slow, structural rust that Broussais' fiery dogma completely failed to explain.
Okay, I understand how they separated the two concepts in the 1800s, but the sources point out that leads to a glaring contradiction we still deal with today.
Oh, definitely.
Take a highly common diagnosis like osteoarthritis. It ends in itis, which clearly implies that inflammation, the fire, is the root cause of the joint problem.
Right.
But modern science defines osteoarthritis as a wear and tear disease.
You've identified one of the most debated misnomers in all of rheumatology. The primary driver of osteoarthritis is not inflammation. The cartilage capping the bones simply wears away over time due to mechanical stress.
So why does the body hurt? I mean, why does the joint swell up if it isn't an itis?
It's because of the mechanism of the wear and tear. As the cartilage physically grinds away, microscopic pieces of it flake off into the joint space.
Okay.
And the body's immune system detects this debris, recognizes it shouldn't be there, and sends an inflammatory cleanup crew to deal with the mess.
So the fire is just a reaction to the rust. It's a downstream symptom, not the root cause.
Spot on, which means it shouldn't end in itis at all.
Wow.
And what is fascinating is that European medical traditions, particularly in France and Germany, recognize this biological reality.
They don't call it osteoarthritis.
No, they actively prefer the term arthrosis, or if they're specifying the knee, they call it gonarthrosis. They use the osis suffix because they correctly categorize it as a degenerative structural process.
But English language medicine just refuses to adapt. We stubbornly stick with osteoarthritis.
Yep. It is another baked-in misnomer that we just accept.
Okay, so if the suffix can be attached to a lab error, or manipulated by marketing, or just plain used incorrectly for a joint disease, does seeing an osis on your chart always mean you are actually sick?
That is the most crucial question for anyone trying to navigate their own health records.
Right.
And the answer is no. Consider the term leukocytosis.
That refers to an elevated white blood cell count, right?
Yes. If a physician sees leukocytosis on your lab results, they know your white blood cells are multiplying.
Which could be bad.
Right. That process could be a response to a severe bacterial infection. But it is also caused by a grueling physical workout.
Wait, really?
Yeah. It is caused by acute emotional stress. It happens naturally during pregnancy. Those are perfectly normal, adaptive physiological responses.
So you could have an osis happening in your bloodstream right now simply because you were, like, stressed out in traffic on the way to the clinics.
Exactly. The suffix alone tells you absolutely nothing about severity or threat level. Equating the condition of leukocytosis with something like necrosis, which is the irreversible death of tissue, is stretching a single grammatical tool across entirely different universes of severity. Context is everything.
That really reframes the entire experience of reading a medical chart. To really ground this for you listening, we have to look at how doctors actually use this word in practice, because osis doesn't exist in a vacuum.
No, it lives in a whole neighborhood of diagnostic suffixes.
Right. And a physician is constantly making choices between those suffixes based on the clinical evidence.
Exactly. You have itis for the inflammatory fire. You have iosis, which indicates the presence of something abnormal, like gallstones.
You have igemia for a blood condition, erypathy for a generalized disease, and algia for pain.
But a really important contrast is oma, which signifies a tumor or a mass.
All right, so when a radiologist looks at a lung scan and chooses to write down a word ending in osis rather than oma, they are communicating something very specific.
They're ruling out a localized, discrete tumor. They are signaling that the disease is a diffuse, structural, often chronic process happening across the tissue.
But just because it isn't an acute fire or a localized tumor doesn't mean it isn't dangerous. Which brings us to a devastating contemporary public health crisis highlighted in our sources.
Yeah, we need to talk about silicosis.
This is where understanding medical terminology shifts from being a fascinating etymological exercise into a matter of urgent public safety.
It really does. Silicosis is a chronic structural lung condition caused by the inhalation of fine crystalline silica dust over a prolonged period.
But the sources noted a massive recent surge in what they call accelerated silicosis. What is the mechanism there? Why is it suddenly accelerating now?
It comes down to the materials being used by modern stonemasons and fabricators. They are working heavily with engineered stone.
You mean like the artificial stone countertops you see in millions of modern kitchens?
Exactly. Natural stone has some silica in it, but Engineered stone can contain up to 90% crystalline silica.
Wow. So when a worker cuts into that engineered stone with a saw, what actually happens?
It releases a cloud of dust that is essentially microscopic glass.
Oh, man.
The worker inhales it deeply into the lungs, and the body's immune cells, the macrophages, try to consume and clear away these glass shards.
But they can't digest silica, right?
No, they can't. The macrophages die, releasing toxins that damage the surrounding lung tissue.
The body panic.
The body panics, and its only defense mechanism is to build thick, fibrous scar tissue around the silica shards to trap them.
And that rampant scarring process, the fibrosis, is the osis.
Yes. The lungs become stiff and unable to exchange oxygen.
It's literally a mechanical destruction of the organ.
And it is so severe and progressing so rapidly in young workers today that in 2024, Australia took the unprecedented step of officially banning the use, supply, and manufacture of engineered stone products entirely.
That is wild. An entire lucrative industry was shut down by the government to stop the spread of a condition described by this one ancient suffix.
It really drives home the point. Whether we are talking about the tens of millions of people managing osteoporosis, the complex realities of cirrhosis, or an industrial hazard like silicosis, these aren't just vocabulary words to memorize for a test.
No, they're the actual frameworks we use to measure human suffering and enact public health policy.
By understanding the history and the mechanics of these words, you strip away the intimidation factor. You realize that the language of medicine wasn't handed down from the heavens on stone tablets.
It was built by flawed human beings. People who were observing the color of organs, making chemical assumptions in the lab, trying to sell consumer products, and trying to protect workers from microscopic glass.
It's just generations of humans trying to put a label on the unknown.
So let's trace the journey we took today. We started in ancient Greece, where osis was nothing more than a neutral grammatical tool to describe a process like osmosis.
Right. We moved to 19th century Paris and Vienna, where pathologists hijacked the suffix to map out the structural rust they were discovering during autopsies.
We saw how that authority got fossilized in a starch-staining chemical coincidence with amyloidosis, and how it was totally weaponized in an advertising boardroom for halitosis.
We explored the biological reality that osteoarthritis is a mechanical breakdown first and an inflammation second.
And most importantly, we established that a word ending in osis requires clinical context. The root word tells you what is involved. The suffix just points out that a process is happening.
So the next time you find yourself sitting on that exam table looking at that crinkly paper and reading a daunting medical report,
remember that osis is not an automatic death sentence. It is just a signpost pointing to a process.
which leaves us with a really compelling question to think about. If 19th century doctors had to repurpose an ancient Greek suffix just to describe the physical changes they were suddenly able to see with early microscopes.
What entirely new vocabulary will the doctors of tomorrow need to invent?
Exactly. I mean, as artificial intelligence, genomic sequencing, and molecular profiling fundamentally redefine what a disease even is, moving away from just what a tissue looks like to the actual genetic coding errors driving it, will osis finally become obsolete?
Are we on the verge of an entirely new language of medicine, one we don't even have the alphabet for yet, just waiting to be born?
Maybe in 100 years, people will look back at our medical charts and wonder why we use such primitive terminology.
It's definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. We hope we've managed to turn a little bit of that medical anxiety into your own personal aha moment. Catch you next time.